The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
If you don't have borders, you don't have a country. Donald Trump said that. Is what we're seeing on our southern border the beginning of the end for states or the nation overrun by immigrants? The end of the beginning? Or much ado about little or nothing? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We will consider just how bad the growing crisis on our border with Mexico has become in these early days of the Biden administration, whether we have the fortitude to come up with a remedy, and how badly this is likely to damage the new president. When we're joined by LibertyNation.com managing editor and international author Mark Angelides. Plus, as the stakes grow ever higher in the battle over the Senate filibuster, we'll deliver the blow-by-blow on the highest-ranking Republican in the nation vowing to go scorched earth if Democrats remove the only vehicle available to the GOP to shut down the Dems' left-wing agenda. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza takes us on a deep dive into the trial of the year, the killing of George Floyd, in Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out an assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. As the southern border, which was a chief focus of the Trump administration, quickly descends back into a state of crisis, the pressure is on the new chief executive to figure it out. But it's going to be hard considering Joe Biden, the candidate, promised in 2020 to stop construction of Trump's border wall and essentially open up the borders which President Trump had secured or closed. Remember this promise by Biden during the presidential campaign, repeated on more than one occasion?
We should not be locking people up. We should be making sure we change the circumstance, as we did, why they would leave in the first place. And those who come seeking asylum, we should immediately have the capacity to absorb them, keep them safe until they can be heard.
Should someone who is here without documents, and that is his only offense, should that person be deported?
That person should not be the focus of deportation.
So many problems with that. First, Biden is learning how much easier it is to say something like we need to immediately accept anyone seeking asylum than to actually enforce such a policy which would likely overrun the country. Second, that he'd be naive enough to believe we can just release them into society and they'll show up for their hearings. They mostly don't. But third, people like Biden who make a career out of politics do so by promising just about anything that'll get them elected. And then they famously turn around and say they can't fulfill the promise for whatever reason. But in this case, you've got hundreds of thousands of immigrants banking on that promise enough to trek north expecting to be greeted at the border. But who instead are now being locked up in, you guessed it, those same cages built by Obama, but for which Trump was called a racist. See how that works? But now, much to their chagrin, Even the transparently pro-Biden, Trump-deranged elite media like George Stephanopoulos of ABC News is being forced to ask the president about it, and he answers as, well, only Joe Biden can.
We're sending back people to, first of all, the idea that Joe Biden said come, because I heard the other day that they're coming because they know I'm a nice guy and I won't do what Trump did.
They're saying this.
Yeah. Well, here's the deal. They're not.
Do you have to say quite clearly, don't come?
Yes, I can say quite clearly, don't come.
Hope you can figure out just what he said. But feels a bit different having to actually deal with a major problem that hasn't been settled for decades instead of just throwing verbal grenades from the cheap seats in a political campaign. Huh, Mr. President? We'll discuss the crisis at the border in depth with Mark Angelides of LibertyNation.com in the next segment. But much has been made in recent days about Biden's friendship with the increasingly embattled New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, who appears to be hanging on to his job by a thread, with the count of women claiming sexual misconduct by Cuomo now at 7 and rising by the week. But this week, the president took the first big step toward throwing his old friend Andrew under the bus.
If the investigation confirms the claims of the women, should he resign?
Yes, I think he probably end up being prosecuted, too. A woman should be presumed to telling the truth and should not be scapegoated and become victimized by her coming forward. And by the way, it may very well be that there could be a criminal prosecution that is attached to it.
Well, so much for old friends in this era of wokeness. If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. Harry Truman said it, and it's been true ever since, and probably before that. But with 7 women now coming forward, we see the continuation of a pattern from recent years where the first woman coming forward opens the floodgates for other silent victims. And so says Deborah Katz, attorney for one of the accusers, a former 25-year-old advisor to Cuomo named Charlotte Bennett.
I think it's a very difficult and highly personal decision about whether to come forward. Most women don't. Most women fear retaliation. And in fact, the EEOC has done a comprehensive study of why women come forward and what happens to women when they come forward. And there's strong evidence that people experience sometimes career derailing retaliation. So for those who are still working with the governor, they need to feel confident that if they come forward, nothing will happen to them in the workplace. And for those women, they may choose to go straight to the investigators rather than coming forward publicly. But it's a very personal choice, and people are quite scared of him.
And for good reason. The Cuomo family, from the father Mario to the sons Andrew and the others who need not be named, has held substantial political power to the point of what you might call something of a political dynasty. And while Cuomo takes a beating on the East Coast, his counterpart on the left coast, California Governor Gavin Newsom, will face a recall election after the recall organizers easily exceeded the 1.5 million signatures needed to put the recall on the ballot. And every bit the politician as his East Coast brother-in-arms, Andrew Cuomo, Newsom says his opponents have been relentless and blames his fate not on widespread anger over his COVID lockdown policy or him getting caught flagrantly violating it at a ritzy restaurant, but right-wing hate groups.
This is the 6th recall effort in just 25 months since I've been governor. You have people that are part of the lead coalition that started this petition that are avid Proud Boy members. They're part of the 3 Percenters, the right-wing militia group. They are supporters of QAnon conspiracy theorists, white supremacist groups. That's not just that's factual. And so at the end of the day, that's the origins of this.
So instead of accepting some blame or apologizing or both for his pandemic policy, he tries to blame essentially Trump. I'm wondering what the over-under is for how long they can get away with blaming Trump for everything, except, of course, the things he did which they're now taking credit for, like the vaccines. But in the nation's capital, Democrats in the House are all a Twitter about passing a COVID relief bill, which is only in small part about the checks we're supposed to get soon for $1,400. That's why they're calling it a stimulus, because in a $1.9 trillion package, less than 10% is actually financial relief for people who lost their jobs during the pandemic. The rest is typical Washington pork, but made to sound like a landmark achievement by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
It's such a major piece of legislation. It's the most significant change for middle-class people, for poor people, people trying to get into the middle class in decades, in a very long time. And it has amazing things in it. How did we do all this? We had Democratic unity. I think, look, I have a diverse caucus from Bernie Sanders to Joe Manchin, and we have no margin for error with 50 votes. But every member of our caucus, to each of his or her credit, realized that we had to get this done.
So the stimulus bill also includes a child tax credit and billions of dollars for public schools and public health programs. But once this mostly popular bill is passed and people get a bit of a jingle in their pocket, they'll be looking at what's left, the heart of the progressive agenda. And rest assured, it will be guided by wokeness to the extreme. Now, we featured a guy on this show a couple of weeks ago, author and psychologist Gad Saad, G-A-D-S-A-A-D, who listed his first 5 reasons that our society is descending into what he calls ultimate lunacy. Today, we list his reasons 6 through 10.
6. It is now Islamophobic to criticize any tenets of Islam. 7. It is now science denialism to question the ongoing COVID lockdowns. 8. It is now science denialism to question any tenets stemming from climate change alarmists. 9. It is now epistemological bigotry to support the scientific method as the means by which you adjudicate scientific hypotheses. 10. It is now racist to argue that mathematics yields right and wrong answers.
Racist to argue that mathematics yields right and wrong answers. So, like, where was that wokeness in math class when I needed it? We'll bring back Mr. Saad in the weeks ahead to summarize more for us America's slow descent into ultimate lunacy. We'll delve into the trial of the year, the killing of George Floyd, a bit later on. But first, a quick break, and then we're back to examine the crisis on the southern border. Existential threat to the nation or tempest in a teapot?
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curriculum. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Though it's certainly possible you're not aware of it because of an elite media that depicted Trump as Hitler and Biden as some sort of savior. We've got A genuine crisis on our southern border that grows worse by the day. More than 500 unaccompanied children, among others, are arriving here every single day. Many of them wearing Biden T-shirts with a pleading message, begging him to keep his campaign promise to open up the borders, upon which they base their dangerous trek to the U.S. border. And now those kids are winding up in those infamous cages built by Obama, blamed on Trump, and condemned by Biden until he had to actually manage the crisis himself instead of attacking Trump from the safety of the cheap seats. So how bad are things at the border? Are we in the midst of the first genuine crisis of the Biden presidency? Or is this more of a tempest in a teapot, as the old saying goes? To answer that question, we bring on a man who's written extensively on the subject, LibertyNation.com managing editor and international author Mark Angelides. Welcome back to the show, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Great to be here.
Always a pleasure. So put in perspective for us the numbers crossing the border now compared to 2 years ago in the midst of the Trump era and the last part of the Obama years, especially the children.
Well, it's quite difficult to get a full picture because obviously we only have the figures for those who make contact or are apprehended. But since Joe Biden's inauguration, for example, we've seen a spike in so-called family member crossings, which is up 170% since the inauguration. Children crossing up 68%. I mean, the best way to look at this is to consider what the Obama officials used to say about what would constitute a crisis. And back in those days, they would say 1,000 people a day, we would consider that a serious crisis. And now we're at roughly 6,000 a day, which so it's crisis times 6.
So what specific changes in policy from Trump to Biden, specific changes, created or enlarged this crisis?
Well, there's obviously the overall general attitude. We've heard from the Homeland Secretary and Biden himself about you're welcome, but don't come yet, which is a terrible thing to do. It's like telling a puppy dog to not eat the chicken. Not yet. You can have it, but not yet. But I think in terms of specifics, there's two main draws for illegal immigrants at the moment. One was stopping the construction of the border wall. This is a signal. It's messaging. What it says is, hey, we're not even going to attempt to keep you out. And the second would probably be the proposed citizenship pathway. In terms of you have hundreds of thousands of people who didn't make the journey before because arguably life would have been measurably better in their home countries as opposed to this immigration limbo that they would be in the United States. Now that it seems less likely that they're going to be in immigration limbo, they're gathering their belongings, they pay the cartels, the coyotes, and they're making the journey.
So, Mark, this crisis grows by the day. Has it grown to the point where even the nakedly pro-Biden media is now forced to pay attention to the situation?
Yeah, as much as they'd prefer not to, I think they have. It's like a self-driving engine. So if they don't cover it, they're accused of being complicit. So they kind of have to. Otherwise, the story runs itself.
Okay, thanks as always, Mark.
Thank you, Tim.
Mark Angelides, LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we'll be back to discuss the highest-ranking Republican in the nation vowing to go scorched earth if Democrats remove the only vehicle available to the GOP to shut down the Democrats' left-wing agenda.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We all know of the many threats posed to conservatives by the outcome of the last election. Biden is president, Democrats in control of both chambers of Congress, the looming threat of court packing, new states added to the union. But make no mistake about it, the most perilous and imminent danger to conservatives and the nation writ large at this moment rests not in the politicians themselves, but in the potential removal of one long-standing rule of the United States Senate. If the rule stands as it has for decades, it'll protect the nation from the most gross excesses of creeping socialism. But if a growing number of progressive Democrats get their way, this all but sacrosanct Senate tradition will be relegated to the dustbin of history and unleash a tidal wave of left-wing legislation. In the parlance of today's internet clickbait, the Senate rule might be termed the one weird trick for preserving the rights of minorities, not racial, but political ones. It's called the filibuster. And while many are familiar with the term, few have focused as tightly on it as we must now. Boiled down to its essence, the filibuster is what distinguishes the House from the Senate and makes the passage of legislation far more difficult. In laying out in no uncertain terms what's at stake here, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell took to the Senate floor this week and engaged in a bit of a constitutional history lesson.
The framers designed the Senate to require deliberation, to force cooperation, and to ensure that federal laws in our big, diverse country earn broad enough buy-in to receive the lasting consent of the governed. James Madison said the Senate should be a complicated check against improper acts of legislation. Thomas Jefferson said great innovation should not be forced on slender majorities.
While the lower chamber has for well over a century required only a simple majority for a bill to pass and be sent to the upper chamber, the Senate requires what might be called a supermajority, 60 votes, to end debate on most topics and move to a vote through a process called cloture. This effectively means any bill reaching the Senate requires 60% of the chamber to vote in the affirmative, as opposed to 50% plus one in the House. And McConnell said where you stand on the filibuster is determined only by whether you control the Senate at the time.
Quote, the legislative filibuster is the most important distinction between the Senate and the House. Without the 60-vote threshold for legislation, the Senate becomes a majoritarian institution, just like the House. Much more subject to the winds of short-term electoral change. No senator would like to see that happen. So let's find a way to further protect the 60-vote rule for legislation. That was the current Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, in April of 2017.
Hypocrisy, thy name is politicians. But then again, we already knew that. Of course, we're well removed from the days of the traditional Senate filibuster depicted in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that famous movie when the senator, played by Jimmy Stewart, stands up and speechifies with righteous indignation for hours on end. These days, it's understood that if the requisite 60 votes can't be mustered for any bill, it'll simply die on the vine. But if President Biden gets his way, Mr. Smith's ghost will return to the upper chamber.
I don't think you have to eliminate the filibuster. You have to do it what it used to be when I first got to the Senate and back in the old days. And that is that a filibuster, you had to stand up and command the floor. And you had to keep talking alone. You couldn't call for, no one could say, quorum call. Once you stopped talking, you lost that, and someone could move in and say, I moved the question of. So you got to work for the filibuster.
So you're for that reform. You're for bringing back the talking filibuster.
I am.
So what Biden is really saying is that he now goes along with his fellow Democrats' move to eliminate the filibuster, dressed up in clever language. Of course, he supported the filibuster for all 47 years of his political career until now, when, like on almost every other issue, he's simply given in to his party's loudest voices or changed his mind, hoping no one would notice. And of course, the elite media pretends they don't. Both sides in this debate face a quandary. The temptations and often ruinous outcomes of unchecked power have been chronicled over centuries. At the same time, no one wants to give up the protection from being steamrolled by a simple majority when they aren't in power. So removal of the filibuster becomes a matter of weighing the short-term gain of making hay while the sun shines against the long-term risk of a 180-degree flip when you become the victim of identical behavior from the other side. The present state of play, where office holders of the two major parties hardly even speak to one another, is exactly why the framers of the U.S. Constitution didn't much care for political parties. They realized the rise of such formalized factions would inevitably create bitter divisions and ultimately lead to the type of ugly tribalism which pervades the republic today. At the same time, they were realists and thus recognized that parties would become an inevitable outgrowth of the system of governance they envisioned. However, their distaste for political parties was surpassed by their fundamental commitment to the protection of political minorities from the tyranny of the majority. So, would they have really favored simple majority rule across the board in the situation we find ourselves in today? One party in full control, but headed by a president with nary a spark of life and the slimmest of majorities in both chambers of Congress? Well, Leader McConnell minced no words in describing what would happen.
Nobody serving in this chamber can even begin to imagine what a completely scorched earth Senate would look like. This is an institution that requires unanimous consent to turn the lights on before noon, to schedule committee business, to move even non-controversial nominees at anything besides a snail's pace. Even the most basic aspects of our colleagues' agenda, the most mundane task of the Biden presidency, would actually be harder, not easier, for Democrats in a post-nuclear Senate that is 50-50. The Senate would be more like a 100-car pileup, nothing moving.
So the battle is now certainly joined. Should today's Democratic majority or any future Republican majorities, as they become increasingly frustrated by the Senate graveyard where House bills go to die, be able to simply pass into law by even a tie vote broken by Vice President Kamala Harris their entire wish list? Should the nation adopt, by the narrowest of margins, a higher minimum wage, an assault weapons ban, radical climate change legislation, comprehensive immigration reform, a new Voting Rights Act, so to speak, with a bare majority in Congress? Well, they would if the filibuster was abolished. Both parties, Democrats with Obamacare, the GOP with their 2018 tax reform bill, have used a parliamentary procedure to effect an end run around the filibuster, the so-called reconciliation process, enabling the passage of landmark legislation which otherwise would not have passed with a simple majority. But this applies to a very limited number of bills, only the ones related to specific things about taxes, spending, and the debt limit. So perhaps if it ain't broke, we shouldn't fix it. Common sense, if not history, dictates that a simple majority should carry the day in the chamber closest to the people, the House, where passion seethes, while the branch originally designed for more detached deliberation, cooler heads prevailing, should require greater consensus. This is why the framers created a bicameral legislature with an upper and lower chamber. They designed a system which would require the support of a broad mass of voters and their representatives, for the expansion of law and governmental authority. Removal of Senate Rule 22 defining the filibuster would require the support of a majority of the members present and voting. The two most moderate Democrats in the Senate, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, have claimed they won't vote to remove it. But they're politicians, so their arms can always be twisted. Indeed, these days, all things seem possible, and rest assured that after the dust cleared from such a weighty and audacious move, the decision to abolish this long-standing Senate rule would rightly be summarized by historians in the future in one simple phrase: canceling the minority. And we'll be back to discuss the trial of the year, the killing of George Floyd.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curriculum. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
And now it is time to talk about the trial of the year, or perhaps the decade, as we welcome you into the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza, who has been at rapt attention witnessing the ever-diminishing liberty of the former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin on trial for the killing of George Floyd. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, Tim.
Let's start with the many issues. One of the most concerning ones is pretrial publicity and whether Officer Chauvin of knee and neck infamy can actually get a fair trial in Minneapolis or anywhere.
Tim, we had an instance over a week ago when the Minneapolis City Council gave $27 million, of course, to Benjamin Crump and the family of George Floyd, and that made international news, as you might imagine. And a number of the jurors did hear about that. And there were 7 jurors at the time that announcement was made that had already been selected for the jury. They went back and talked to those jurors, and they actually had to kick 2 loose because that settlement announcement sufficiently prejudiced them that Chauvin wasn't going to be able to get a fair trial.
Now, it seems that an arrest video from 2019 has emerged as a possible factor in this trial.
That's a huge factor, Tim. In 2019, in a video that would be that everybody in the planet would know like the back of their hand if it was somehow damaging, I think, to Mr. Chauvin. It's a bit speculative, but instead what it does is it totally decimates and destroys the notion that Mr. Floyd's behavior in May of 2020 was an outlier, a one-off, that he was responding to the prompts by the police or was in a particular state, because he did almost the same thing a couple of years prior. And what I mean by almost the same thing is when approached by police officers while in a car with drugs, he went into a highly emotional state. He refused to obey any orders in order to, seems like, to conceal and consume those drugs. He refused to put his hands where they could be seen. He screamed about not wanting to be murdered, and he cried out for his mama. All those things that in part made the 2020 video recorded on the day he died so powerful. But then we learned that he did almost the same thing previously. It takes a lot of the I'm not sure what the right word is, but, the outrage and the emotion surrounding that other video, I think it takes a lot out of it. And so for that reason, any exposure a jury has to that in Mr. Chauvin's trial, I think accrues to Chauvin's benefit, Tim.
Okay, talk to us a little bit about jury selection and the issue of race, which obviously incited this whole thing in response to the killing of George Floyd. How was the jury selected, and to what extent can race be claimed as an issue on the jury by those who want to see Derek Chauvin hang.
Well, there's a special rule for, and Tim, I'll just say right away, I don't know that that's an option on the table. I think 40 years confinement is the maximum sentence that Chauvin
I said wanted to see him hang, not that they expected to see him hang.
Well, listen, in some places, so there's a special rule for juror selection based on some immutable characteristics. Generally speaking, you're allowed to, if you're an attorney and you're trying to pick a jury, you can excuse any juror for cause. And that means a juror refuses to grant your client, if he's the defendant, the presumption of innocence, for instance, as we all know that we enter the courtroom with, or many other factors. You can say, well, this person is unwilling to be a fair juror, and the judge will, if there's compelling evidence to suggest that, the judge will have to agree and dismiss that juror. Then there are these other ways to strike a juror, and it's called a peremptory challenge. And it's just the fact that you just don't like the cut of the juror's jib, or for some other reason that's hard to articulate to the court, you're allowed to strike them. It's how we get to presumably fair juries in this country. Both the defense and the prosecution get a certain number of these peremptory strikes. But there's this special rule, Tim, that was instituted in this case called Batson decades ago by the Supreme Court. And there's something called a Batson challenge. And how this usually works. So many things about this case, by the way, are kind of flipped on their head. How this usually works is defense attorneys representing black clients think that prosecutors are trying to deselect blacks from the jury, okay, and select only whites. That's sort of how this whole thing got started. And so what then would happen in a Batson challenge is a prosecutor would say to the judge, hey, I think that these picks are being made on the basis of race, and that should be impermissible. And then the judge inquires of the lawyers to look for a non-race-based reason for the strike. Now, here, things are a little bit flipped on their head. It's the defense attorneys that struck a woman and then another man who both happened to be Hispanic in the first week of jury selection. In fact, in the first day, I believe, of jury selection, Tim, and the prosecution alleged that the only reason why they were stricken was because of their race. Well, the judge did not agree, and he allowed those jurors to be stricken. So race is in every way present in this case. And as I reported for LibertyNation.com, the current racial makeup is wildly outsized to the exclusion of whites, which are a majority in both Minneapolis and Minnesota.
Fascinating stuff. So, Scott, we've got a bit of a David and Goliath set up in the courtroom, where on one side you've got a single lone defense attorney defending a man who may be the most unpopular man in the world against dozens of prosecutors intent on bringing him down.
Well, I think at least one dozen. I don't know if I'd go plural dozens, but
well, it only seemed like dozens.
Yeah. The judge himself, he's been very temperate with his remarks, as he should be. There's only a few instances where he's kind of gone off the handle for him. I don't mean he's acted inappropriately in a judicial setting, but it sort of raised his ire. And one of those instances happened on Thursday afternoon, Tim, when the prosecution criticized the defense counsel for bringing up something in court and not basically creating an affidavit or a legal filing to then file it immediately after court. And the judge went off on the prosecution team, and he said, how many lawyers do you have working on this case? This is one person. I can't penalize him for being unable to basically instantly create a legal document when he's been in this courtroom since 8:30 picking a jury. Meanwhile, the city council of Minneapolis continues to make public statements which prejudice the selection of the jury. The state of Minnesota has thrown everything at hanging, for lack of a better term, Derek Chauvin. Okay, Tim, it is just a tidal wave of prosecutorial pressure coming down on the defendant.
Scott, we're going to count on you to keep us abreast of all developments in this trial of the year or the decade, both here on Liberty Nation Radio and on the pages of LibertyNation.com, plus your own podcast, The Uprising. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott. And The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com. and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.